I unfortunately still don't have any selfies with Macron, but it's still on my target. But indeed, we do participate in lots of conversations on how AI can be more open, and not only just open for some time, but actually in a sustainable way. And so my talk will be quite different. I will use less, let's say, examples of what is how the open source probably is catching up, but I will talk about some of the structural difficulties that we still do have for the AI commons, but also how can we probably, and in quite surprising ways, how we can go with this. So I was very much let's say, stunned when to one of my blog posts, I received an anonymous comment from a long-time Wikipedian, basically saying, on present evidence, open doesn't have the teeth or the pocket to compete in the AI era. And this is something that basically coming from a person who has been working on the commons, and also not only basically in the content space, but also in the software, and as well as, let's say, general digital commons, was something that really stunned me. And indeed, how it all happens. If we took into consideration the open source movement or the common movements before the AI, and specifically before the generative AI, it's true that every prior commons assumed that infrastructure is not a huge cost. Basically, you needed to put cognitive efforts, you needed to do governance, you needed to do collaboration, of course, whether it be for open software projects, whether it be for Wikipedia, right? But basically, it went down to having people who are enthusiasts and who are willing to contribute their time. The situation is very much different when it comes to the AI. And why so? Because we have the cost of training models, and not only frontier models, but any kind of models, which is there. You cannot not have this infrastructure cost for both process and training data, and also for training AI models. And this is where basically the situation becomes, from the very beginning, tense. How do we build AI commons, right? How do we build it in the collective? How do we build it to be sustainably open, even when for each stage, from training to inference, we need the infrastructure, which costs much more than basically putting the cognitive effort of people who will create it. Another thing with the open source AI is that, yes, you cannot kind of fork a training run, right? You can take the checkpoints, you can start working from that on, but here, the situation is that it is still not something that is as malleable as the open software would be. And another point, what we are seeing is that because of this, open source AI right now is fully driven by corporations. What we are saying is open weights models done by Meta, done by IBM, by other actors sometimes, but Mistral. But those not are models, or let's say those are not AI models which are coming from the community, and except for, let's say, Alan AI, right, which has, or Ulither AI, which had been this institution who actually managed to do more of this, but on the level which is not necessarily what allows for this to be sustainable. And now we are seeing also how much difficulty Alan AI is having actually with continuing their work. We understand this is the problem, and of course, the problems coming also from the investment that the corporations versus open movements might dispose of. And from what one of the points that I really want to kind of insist on is the fact that we have been in this situation where open weights has largely been considered enough, right? So basically, if we have an open weights model, is kind of good, right? Like you can build on top of this. You can create some of the tools which can be then used if the license, of course, allows it in the commercial ways, right? So it's kind of open source. The problem that I'm personally seeing with this is that there are two problems. The first one is the kind of licenses, and specifically coming from the corporations, once again, IBM, Meta, let's say the sustainability of the system where we build on the models, which licenses can be reverted and changed the next day, is very problematic to me. This has already happened with, for example, Llama, which license was changed for Europe, right? It already happened with Quen licenses. And the problem is that when we are building the products, and if we are building as companies which actually say, okay, I'm going towards open weights because this is something that gives me more control, this is something that gives me independence, etc., and we are building on the situation where these corporations can basically change their approach to these licenses. Well, this is, for me, this is a real problem. Another point is that what's basically happening is that as of now, most of, actually all of open weights models, they're operating with Apache or MIT licenses, which are of course amazing, right, for downstream commercial use. But what is happening with the creators, which are not corporations, and which are basically creating these models, on top of which the companies, sometimes very big companies, build the models, and there is no reversibility. There is literally no way of establishing, right, a sort of, let's say, even the kind of attribution mechanism, right? Because the inference could be either happening on their infrastructure or through third-party providers. And for this, there is a real issue. So, for example, LNAI, okay, they build the models, or Pleias, we also built our models, right? You build the foundation model, you put a very substantial amount of funds, which are, once again, not only your personal costs, but compute and all of the investment which goes basically with the creation of foundation model. What happens next? If you do not serve your models, right, like on the compute which belongs to you, and if you do not charge people for the tokens that they consume, there is literally no way to instead of, well, outside of course, more of like consulting and things like this, to ensure that you get any kind of you get any kind of reversibility. And another very important point for me, for a person who actually comes from the data part of the things, is that most of, like almost the totality, except for some of LNAI models, etc., most of the models, they are open weights, right? Like, so the difference is that for most of the open weights models, the training data is not open. And this thing has been, for me, one of the main irritators, and not exclusively for the reason that, yes, open software and really truly open AI models should be reproducible. This is not this kind of more conceptual thing, but also the fact that once you want to actually align or fine-tune models with which you work, for example, on your infrastructure, the fact of not having access to their training data is a huge issue. You operate in the obscure, completely blind, and trying to align what you do not know actually how it has been really done. And training data here is a very important point. And training data, well, you would say, okay, so how, but even if it's open, how do we actually know what's inside? This is just a huge amount of common crawl and web archives. And here, what I also want to say is that we do need to have more provenance-based approaches, right? For this to be really auditable, for the data to be auditable, and to be really more open source. So, and here, like just a small apartheid, this kind of problem of, let's say, having a real need for the commons, right? For the AI to be, for the infrastructure to be actually a common good, right? For multiple reasons. And the fact that it actually requires quite some funding. This this is not a new problem, okay? We have already been there before. And the previous capital-intensive and even like too consequential for monopolies, too important to skip, this kind of things already happened. And for example, railways, electricity, telecom, right? Those are just some of the examples where we needed to invent the new institutional answers, which didn't just come through some companies, some monopolies or oligopolies, where we needed to have a response which comes through the societal change as well as through also the changes in the states. So now the institutional form is yet to be invented, definitely. And I think that one of the things which are also very important to me is that the idea that AI should be, there should be part of AI which is in commons, is not only the fact of economic competitiveness, right? And the fact that we need to have a distribution of value across the economy, which is not concentrated in very few places. It's also a question of maintaining plurality, which is really a condition of thought. We do need to have models which are not designed exclusively by a small group of people and which are then somehow a little bit more aligned, but not really, and then the real personality of the model comes through. We need to have this infrastructure for the AI to really be a common, which would allow to basically for people to contextualize their community experiences, their local cultural experiences through the AI, and for this you actually need to have the infrastructure which would be suitable for the commons. And indeed, the two problems are, as I said, compute, yes, but also data. For the AI commons to actually start happening, we need to rethink how the compute, the public compute, and the data could operate in this space. One of the things is that there are multiple initiatives right now happening around public compute, specifically also with some decentralized initiatives, right, which could be a very interesting venue for how we can actually train in distributed ways AI and then to serve it also in the ways which actually would allow the better reversibility and the better distribution. And basically also another point is that we need to rethink of how we work with the data. What happens now is that we have this sort of like commons enclosure, right? So basically companies have extracted humanity common knowledge, kind of train models on this and then serve them and then extract benefit from this. Okay, that's cool. How then we can imagine kind of turning things a little bit around so that the value of the data that is being used, right, like for example, some of the public data, even public domain data, or some of like proprietary that could be put in the spot lock, let's put it this way, and all of this data work can then be reversed. And some of the interesting things that I'm thinking about is really having the public compute infrastructure, which is used for model training and where the data contributors will actually be compensated through the open model inference, right? So the public compute being, let's say, open, being owned by a foundation or this kind of things, where the communities can come, contribute their data, and be compensated based on the inference, right, that we are actually selling this. And another point, which would be really important, is that the license model per se, right, like before we actually pass to any kind of license into the companies, I really think that we should imagine a sort of copyleft license for the AI models. This might seem as something that is actually closing things, but I do truly believe for the AI commons and for the models like this to exist in sustainable fashion, we might think of, okay, so this is something that is open but is with copyleft license. And then if you are a company, for example, joining the foundation and contributing a certain amount of money, you can have it with a Apache or MIT license and then build even proprietary products on top of this. And I think that basically rethinking a little bit all of these things could be quite interesting. And I do believe, and I finish with this, that we kind of have now a very interesting possibility of the coalition, which has never been actually possible before in the commons space, between the enterprises which see in all of this SaaSpocalypse, which are seeing how the labs are becoming these huge actors, right, even in their field of economic fields. I think that enterprises might be interested for the AI commons to happen to actually keep their competitiveness, right? So there is a question of competitiveness for the enterprises, and they could be interested in this more decentralized AI commons. And of course, for the communities, and for us even as individuals, this kind of commons development is something that I think many share, and I think even many more people would share when we will be dealing with, let's say, AI and, like, for example, I don't know, Anthropic licenses, even for individuals, which would be priced not with the margin which is actually allowing for Anthropic to be, for example, a company which is trading well on the public markets. Thank you so much for your attention.